Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are talking about Unit 9, the Modern Civil Rights Movement, and we are covering Lesson 4, the Presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson, known as LBJ. Make sure to write down your heading and make sure to write down today's essential question. How did the Great Society change America? With LBJ, we're going to be talking about his programs to help rid America of poverty. Poverty means to be poor. We called these over 200 programs designed to end poverty, to increase civil liberties, protect civil rights for Americans, the Great Society. It's kind of like the New Deal under FDR from the 1930s during the Depression 2.0. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. Starting off on a sad note, on November 22nd, 1963, while on tour to begin his campaign for re-election in Texas, in fact, in the city of Dallas, Texas, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated by the assassin Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, Oswald had had an interesting career in the United States military as a sniper, had actually gone and lived over in the Soviet Union for a year in 1959, and had been a bit of a radical. And it was possible that this was part of a larger conspiracy. But to this day, all of the commissions and reports and findings have indicated that Oswald was a lone shooter. And while Kennedy and his motorcade were traveling along right in front of the Book Depository building in Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald shot from the 6th floor of that building down at the motorcade and struck President Kennedy through the head and through his neck. And there's this famous picture here right before the assassin shoots Kennedy while their motorcade is going by. They were in a special car designed for the president to wave and stuff. You have the governor of Texas, John Conley, there seated in front of Kennedy. He also was actually struck, but survived at the hospital. The second bullet that goes through Kennedy enters through the back of his head, and so Kennedy was dead upon impact of that second bullet, maybe from the first as well. His wife, Jackie, there was, nobody's sure exactly what she was doing. She was in panic, obviously. She got elements of brain matter and blood from her husband on her. And so she was trying to climb on the back, maybe to reach the Secret Service member behind their car as the motorcade sped up to get to the hospital. There's Oswald, the assassin. What complicates matters in the assassination of JFK and has led to many of the conspiracy theories that have arisen about Kennedy's death are many factors, but probably the biggest is that Oswald right here, you can see he's actually being shot by local Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby, who later testified that he shot Oswald not to silence him for any reason, but rather so that Mrs. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, wouldn't have to go through, having to see her husband's killer in trial. So that's a very weak story, and it's led to many of the conspiracy theories. But on that day, on Air Force One, as they're taking Kennedy's body back to Washington, D.C., the vice president from Texas, that's why they were in Texas, they were campaigning and stuff together there. In fact, Lyndon Johnson, he's the vice president. His car was just right behind Kennedy's when all this happened. But LBJ is sworn in on Air Force One as the new president. Was Kennedy's death part of the Cold War? Did it have to do with his, anti-communist rhetoric? Was it part of his failed, embarrassing Bay of Pigs invasion and the anger that the frustration the CIA had with Kennedy? Did his death have something to do with the civil rights movement and Kennedy's, affirmations and proposals like the Civil Rights Act from 1963? Did Kennedy's death have something to do with the Kennedy family's wealth and the Kennedy family's mob connections, like Frank Sinatra and everything? There's so many conspiracy theories out there. I'm going to let you guys do your own research on them. But again, what we have in the history books is that it is the lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. Nothing else has been proven. There you have John Conley and his wife, the governor of Texas. There you have JFK You could see Texans loved Kennedy. Everybody loved Kennedy. Everybody loved his beautiful wife, Jackie Kennedy, and their young children. And remember, Kennedy, Kennedy was Camelot. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy, their presidency was a new era for the United States. Young, invigorating, inspiring leader who was meant to help usher us into a new modern era of hope and prosperity. And to have him be silenced, to have him be killed, you know, when he's seen as such a young, dynamic, inspiring leader, that was really hard for the nation. Remember, my mom was an elementary school girl when this happened in 1963. And she recalls her teacher being called into the hallway and being told by the principal that the president had just been assassinated, and the teacher came back in. It was just crying, you know. Everybody was crying, like this was a beloved leader. No, not making any comments on leaders today or anything, but you know, it struck the nation really hard. And so we're a nation in mourning when Lyndon Johnson now is sworn in as, you know, the vice president, now becoming the president. Lyndon Baines Johnson, let's talk about it for just a second. Who is this vice president that Kennedy had? So Kennedy was from Massachusetts, a Northern Democrat. He had the Harvard accent. Remember, Kennedy like famously gave his inspiring speeches like, "We choose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." Or he said, you know, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," you know. It's got that Boston accent. LBJ is from Texas. He is a Southern Democrat. He's actually from the Hill Country, kind of just down south of where we're at here in Waco. Think of kind of the surrounding areas of Austin, a little bit south and of Austin and stuff. And Lyndon Johnson was born not like the Kennedys, who were super, super rich. Johnson was born pretty poor. He attended school in like a one room, you know, wooden little shack. And had to work really hard to get through college and stuff, and actually, you know, kind of married a wealthy woman to get a lot of his early business and political opportunities. Lady Bird Johnson was very important for Johnson's political rise, his wife. And so, and Johnson, by the way, also interesting in his upbringing here in Texas, Johnson went to a public university, couldn't afford a private college. And so he attended Texas State, which at the time was called Southwest State Teachers College. And so Johnson, here he is in this picture, just 21 years old. He was a school teacher right out of college. And he got a job at Cotulla, Texas. That's south of here, the Hill Country. And in Cotulla, he taught at this all Hispanic segregated middle school. And we're schools in Texas in the early 1900s, excuse me, they were segregated. Not just African-American students were segregated, but Hispanic students were as well. And so this school that Johnson taught at was incredibly impoverished, very poor. They didn't have money for extracurricular opportunities, no sports teams, no band, no choir, none of that stuff. And so Johnson actually, out of his own pocket, you know, his own money, purchased like mitts and baseball gloves and bats and stuff so that the school could have its first ever baseball team. And he put it together and stuff. But the experience that LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, had at teaching at this segregated Hispanic school as this young school teacher, that stayed with him for the rest of his life. You know, his upbringing is incredibly important for what he's going to do later on as president, because he is going to be the president for education. He's going to be the president that is going to work to end segregation, because legally, segregation was already supposed to have ended with the Brown v. Board decision from 1954. But in practice, it really hadn't ended anywhere. You still saw segregated schools throughout the South. Very few had actually desegregated. We saw the fight for that, you know, and how difficult that was with the instance in 1957 of the Little Rock Nine. And so Johnson will make it his mission, because of his experiences, like with those Cotulla kids there, to basically end segregation. to bring kids of all colors into the same schools, to give everyone an opportunity to live their life and get a piece of the American dream. That was what Johnson really cared about. So that's where that comes from. As far as his life after being a public school teacher, he's the only president, by the way, that will have ever been a public school teacher previously. I think that's kind of cool. And he launches his political career, I'm not going to get into all that, but he's going to become a senator and actually gets to meet his hero, Franklin Roosevelt, during the 1930s when he was a freshman senator and congressman, I think, and then senator. And becomes a very powerful leader of the Senate, and was really inspired by FDR's New Deal. He wants to do like his own New Deal, a bunch of programs from the government to help the people and give people who most needed it opportunities. Now, because of all of his experience working in the House and especially working and leading the United States Senate, as this Texas senator, the Senate Majority Leader, Johnson has a special method he developed called the Johnson treatment for how to wrangle senators and congressmen and get them to vote the way he wanted them to. And you can see in these pictures, this here is the Johnson treatment. He was a big man. He was, I believe, about 6'5", and he would use his very tall, large frame to kind of intimidate others, get really close, lean in, and, cajole, bribe, compliments, I was a brown nose, and threaten, very good at threatening. These senators and these congressmen, twisting their arm and stuff into getting them to vote the way that he wanted to. He would do whatever it took, basically. And while that sounds kind of mercenary, that's kind of what America needed. We needed somebody who was willing to push to get changes to happen, because change doesn't come easy. And so this is how we're going to get under Johnson, the Great Society. So let's talk about, we'll go into more detail in the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, but a big part of the Great Society, let's take a step back. It's the New Deal 2.0. The New Deal was in the 1930s under President Franklin Roosevelt, hundreds of government programs designed to help get America out of the Great Depression. The Great Society is like over 200 government programs in the 1960s designed to help get America out of poverty. And not just to help get America out of poverty, to help those who are poor, but also to help affirm civil rights. To help give equal opportunities to everyone, regardless of your race, regardless of your gender, regardless of where you come from, regardless of your income level. It was designed to help give everybody an equal opportunity. That is the Great Society. That is what Johnson truly, this is his baby, this is what he believes in, this is what he's trying to accomplish. So a big part of that is the Civil Rights Act of 64. We're going to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 65, which is going to eliminate the poll taxes and literacy tests, make sure that everyone can be able to vote. And then a lot of these programs are about his war on poverty. Like I said, getting Americans out of the poorest living condition. So a lot of these Great Society programs could be considered part of Johnson's war on poverty, literally trying to end poverty in America. He wants to create jobs, just like a lot of those New Deal programs did. Remember, like the WPA, the CCC, they literally were the government providing jobs to help get people out of, the Great Depression. This is that for the 1960s, because we still had 25% of people living below the poverty line in the United States in the 1960s when Johnson became president. So he wants to, get people education, give people training so they can get good jobs, so they can have a good life. That's a big part of the war on poverty, which was a big part of the Great Society. Also, in addition to trying to improve America's education, jobs, in trying to improve our civil liberties and civil rights, the Great Society is also going to focus on improving health care in the United States. And as part of this, we're going to get Medicare and Medicaid. So remember, in the New Deal in the 1930s, the Social Security Act, the Social Security Administration, That's where you have a retirement pension set up. Once you reach age 65, you can start to access that money. So you don't have to work until you die. It's your retirement. But there wasn't anything provided for healthcare. And that's something that the elderly especially really have need of. Hospital bills are really high. And in America, even to this point in time, really all we have is private insurance. So if you can't afford it, you can't really get help. In the 1960s, that changes with, in the Great Society, Medicare. It's healthcare basically for the elderly. And Medicaid, that's healthcare, insurance that's paid by the government for people, for the poor. So if you're below the poverty line, you qualify for Medicaid, you can get assistance on your medical bills, on your insurance. Medicaid is that health insurance, that healthcare for the elderly, those that are age 65 and over. And so those two things, a good way to keep them apart, to remember what both of them are for, this is because they're both part of the Great Society, they're both healthcare, is I remember that Medicare is like you care for the elderly, they need care if you're an elderly old person. And then Medicaid, you aid the poor. The poor, they need help, they need assistance, they need aid, okay? So that's kind of how I keep them straight. But both are talking about healthcare, and this was the first time that the government really offered something like this. And as far as healthcare today, like think of Obamacare and what Biden's trying to do with the new Biden care and stuff that's going to be proposed probably in the next year or two. That's called universal healthcare. That's health insurance by the government for everyone that many Western nations in the world have today. America does not. We still, for most people, if you don't qualify for Medicare or Medicaid, you are stuck relying on your employer's health insurance or your own private insurance that you can hook up for yourself. So again, it's are you rich enough to afford, health insurance, which is terrible for a lot of people who aren't quite poor enough to be, qualifying for Medicaid, but aren't rich enough to be able to afford those exorbitant, hospital bills. There's not really an alternative. Most people, they get sick, they don't even want to go to the hospital. It's so expensive. And so that's where there are proposals that are very interesting about maybe trying to make something like Medicare accessible for everyone, not just those who are over a certain age limit. Anyway, so that's Medicare, Medicaid, part of the Great Society. You're also going to have the introduction of a new department to our executive cabinet, and that is going to be the Department of Housing and Urban Development. That's called HUD. Get it, HUD, Housing and Urban Development. And it was about bringing aid or money to cities, funding to have urban renewal. Urban decay was happening in downtown areas as you had white flight from the 50s, many white families leaving the urban centers, the city centers, and going out to live, in the suburbs. And with those middle class, upper class whites leaving the cities, cities were often dried up of their income base for taxes. And so that left very little funding to help the cities, their roads, their infrastructure, all those things. And so cities were starting to look like slums, like wastelands, like terrible, terrible impoverished areas. And so HUD was going to try to fix this urban decay problem. It's going to also try to provide affordable housing for many elderly Americans and those Americans who had lived or were living in poverty. Housing and urban development was meant to try to rectify or fix those issues. Remember, issues that had developed, way back from the FHA, from the New Deal, or from the GI Bill, where many people, especially minorities, were not able to access certain housing advantages. The Immigration Act of 1965, I doubt it's going to be tested on your STAR test, but the main thing here is that it's going to set up more of the modern immigration standards that we have today. Remember, the last time we really talked about immigration laws was in the 1920s. In the 1920s, like with the National Origins Act of 1924, you had the government in the grips of the Red Scare, the fear of communism, trying to restrict immigration severely from places like in Southern and Eastern Europe. And they established a system of quotas where you limit the number that can come in. You limit to a very specific small number that was based on like 1890s numbers. Only 2% of the Italian population that came in 1890 can now come in 1924 onward. So anyway, we were very restrictive. we didn't allow very many people to come from Eastern Europe or from Southern Europe. We were very limiting to places that we were discriminating against because of our Red Scare. In 1965, this new immigration law is going to change the quota system to basically make it, instead of different quotas, different numbers and percentages for different countries based on our discrimination and fear of those places and those peoples, it's going to establish equal quotas for all countries. So now Mexico is treated the same as Poland, which is treated the same as Russia, which is treated the same as India, and so on. You get the idea. All countries are going to have the equal number allowed in, which sounds better, right? Like equal sounds better. But equality is not the same thing as fairness, because some countries have a greater need to have more immigrants come to the United States than other countries. Think about this. Isn't it true that countries that are close to the United States, like our actual neighbors, like Canada and Mexico, would have a greater need of having larger immigration quotas than, say, a country such as Myanmar, halfway around the world? And so for that reason, actually, this new immigration law brought up some new challenges. It's not going to fix the problems that had existed back from the 20s. It's going to create new ones. All right, and then we get to the last thing I want to talk to you guys about today. And this is the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act, two really big, important parts of the Great Society. And actually, tell you what, before we do that, other important things in the Great Society, because the Great Society is huge. A lot of the programs like Medicare and Medicaid we still have today. One other program I would really like for you guys to add to your notes, and I'm going to be talking about with my in-person students as well to have them add to their notes, is the ESEA, okay? So that stands for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, okay? And the ESEA passed in 1965. That's going to be huge for basically getting schools to finally desegregate. What it did was it's going to provide massive funding for schools that met certain criteria. So for instance, if a school had desegregated and allowed Black students to come into a white school and so forth, then that school got lots of money. A school that refused to desegregate and continued to have segregation, and it didn't allow Black students in, they wouldn't get any money. And for that simple reason, that's why from 1965 onward, you're going to have massive desegregation of America's schools finally occurring because the money. So that was the ESEA, and it was very important to actually desegregating America's schools. Remember, that was a long, hard-fought process that had begun back in 1954 of the Brown v. Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court. Another important Great Society program that I would really like for you guys to know about, two more actually having to do with education, are going to be Head Start, which you could just put in your notes. That's like basically pre-K, paid for by the government. Because a lot of students come into kindergarten or first grade, as the case was back then, without being able to read or without even knowing their ABCs or their 1, 2, 3s, their numbers. And so Head Start was a way to equalize the playing field so that all kids could start school kind of at the same page. And also to provide, daycare basically for a lot of these, preschool kids for parents who had to work, who were coming from low income situations, from poverty. So that's Head Start, and Head Start is still around today. It's a very successful government program. The other education program you really need to know about is called Upward Bound, which we do have at University High School. And Upward Bound was for students from low-income families to be able to get a head start going into college. So Upward Bound is talking about going into college. If you come from a family where your parents never went to college, it's probably a very daunting process. Your parents don't have the experience. They might want you very strongly to be able to get in college, but they won't know what steps to take or how to help you. Upward Bound is the program that's there to try to help families and students understand what steps they need to take in order to not only get into college, but afford college and be successful in college. It's a program that we have throughout high school to help get you ready for college. Kind of like AVID, right? And let's see. There's also a lot of funding for the arts as part of the Great Society. Like, it's over 200 programs. It's a lot of really important programs that are still around today. As far as funding for the arts, the NEA, National Endowment for the Arts, is going to be a big part of that. You also have PBS, public broadcasting, of all of its great programs. Literally, it's Johnson and the Great Society that created Sesame Street. And you're also going to have NPR, National Public Radio, which I love. Our local NPR station, 103.3, is a great example. NPR right there. So all of these programs are part of the Great Society to help better inform, better educate Americans, again, helping us to be a better, a greater society. And Johnson, this is what he truly was invested in. This is what he wanted to do as president. He wanted to be the education president, based on his experiences. This is who he wanted to help, low-income kids. This is his driving force of action. But a lot of the Great Society programs, they're going to be diminished or even erased completely after Johnson leaves because of the Vietnam War. We're going to talk about in the next unit, this war that Johnson does a lot to get America very heavily invested into. Beginning in 1964, a lot of the funding for the Great Society is taken away. And then Johnson, because of how unpopular the Vietnam War is, Johnson will be forced to step down. And he decides not to run for re-election in 1968. And so the next president, Richard Nixon, and then ensuing American presidents, they either don't put much funding or much enforcement into these Great Society programs. We'll see that like with school busing and other things that go on later. Once these programs go away, then the problem kind of, it never really gets fixed or it comes back. So that's one of the issues to keep in mind with the Great Society. It's really a good thing. But, and then the poverty rate does drop. It goes from 25% or more of Americans living in poverty down to 10%, but then it goes back up again. You can see that right here, that after Johnson leaves, after a lot of these Great Society programs, they lose their funding. See the poverty rate, it doesn't continue to go down, it kind of stagnates, stays the same. Okay, now we could talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, is really going to use John F. Kennedy's death in order to help push through this legislation through Congress. Remember, the Johnson treatment, he will do whatever it takes to get a law passed that he believes in. And the Civil Rights Act was proposed by Kennedy after the Birmingham campaign in Alabama. Remember the SCLC, MLK, they had been trying to end segregation in this terrible, terrible Alabama racist city of Birmingham. And that's where you had the Children's Crusade with those kids marching through the streets and everything, being hauled away in those buses and stuff. They filled the jail cells. That's where MLK wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail, where he reaffirmed the need for the non-violent civil rights movement. So as a reaction to Americans sitting home shocked, watching on television as, fire hoses and police dogs were being unleashed on innocent African-American children in Birmingham, Kennedy's going to propose to Congress this Civil Rights Act. And what it said is that we're going to end discrimination, by racist means, discrimination against race, discrimination against gender, discrimination against national origin. We're going to end discrimination in all public places, in public accommodations like restaurants and hotels. We're going to end discrimination in job hiring, at least, in the public sector where the government could influence it. And we're going to end discrimination in voting. We're going to do all those things. And Kennedy tried to get this passed, but Kennedy did not have enough support in Congress, and Kennedy gets assassinated in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, before he could see this enacted. And so Johnson will take up this law and basically tell America, and by extension, tell the congressmen and the senators, that this is Kennedy's legacy, that if we wanted to truly honor the memory of our slain president, this needed to be passed. It's kind of a little, it's a little bit twisting the knife there of Johnson to use Kennedy like that. But I mean, he was right. This is something Kennedy strongly believed in, and that Kennedy couldn't get passed. So he said, let's get it passed now to honor him. And it worked. And Johnson, he did his treatments. He wrangled enough votes. And then this landmark Civil Rights Act finally in July of 1964 gets signed into law by LBJ. And so it is a huge one, ending discrimination in public places. No longer can restaurants have, a whites only counter and blacks sitting at the back. No longer can hotels deny African Americans the ability to purchase a hotel room. No longer the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission under the Civil Rights Act of 64. That's why every time you guys go to apply for a new job, when you fill out that job application, it says, we do not discriminate on the basis of race, gender, blah, 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 right? That's from the Civil Rights Act. This is a huge, huge law that changes the way America operated. It's a big deal. And it happened largely as a result of Kennedy dying and Johnson, getting those votes, wrangling those votes. And it's not just the politics. Of course, this law would not have been possible were it not for the thousands and thousands of civil rights protesters, not just MLK and the others, but the thousands of protesters that marched in those demonstrations, that were arrested for civil disobedience, that did those sit-ins, those college students. It would not have been possible were it not for their efforts, bringing national attention to this issue. And then the last law, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as a result of Selma, as a result of Freedom Summer, where three of the the Congress on Racial Equality, remember that Northern Civil Rights movement, they were trying to register Black voters down in the South. Three of them were murdered in Mississippi in the summer of 1963, 1964. Selma, the march in 1965 from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama. Remember Bloody Sunday and all of that stuff that we talked about in lesson 2. As a result of all of these movements, it was necessary for there to be a Voting Rights Act so that Blacks could enact change, so that they could vote, so that they could have a voice. The government is going to outlaw the practice of literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses. All of those things are going to be banned. States can no longer get away with trying to deny a person their right to vote because of who they were, what they look like. And so it's also going to include enforcement to make sure that those practices that forbid a person from voting will be gotten rid of. And then it's worth noting that today there are some southern states, such as Texas, such as Arizona famously, that are enacting provisions such as the voter ID laws that are meant to basically target minorities, people of color, African Americans, Hispanics. They're being targeted by these state laws, these voter laws, to try to keep them from being able to vote. And it's important to remember our history. It's important to remember the Voting Rights Act of 65 and the Great Society and these challenges that people in our past, in our own country, had overcome and been forced to overcome. Because if they didn't fight those things and didn't get that change, we wouldn't have the possibilities, the opportunities that we have today. And if we don't fight and learn from what they did, then some of these problems will come back up, because there's always evil out there trying to basically, take back theirs, and we have to basically fight against it. So that's a good lesson from the past, because actually there are big portions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that have been eliminated in recent times. Okay, thank you guys so much, and I will talk to you guys later. That is the end of lesson 4. Please make sure that you have a summary. Don't forget to answer the essential question. All the way with LBJ 1968, 1964, 1960.